In January 1915, an Antarctic expedition under the command of the famed explorer Ernest Shackleton became icebound in the Weddell Sea, which is that part of the Southern Ocean that is bound on one side by the Antarctic Peninsula and the other side by Coats Land. Icebound means that it was stuck in floating ice that becomes so packed together that it becomes ice pack. And for Shackleton and the crew of his ship, the Endurance, it was the beginning of a legendary adventure. But for generations of explorers and scientists that came after, it was a cautionary tale about the risks of trying to navigate in the world's most hostile environment. And one ship spent more time in that environment than almost any other. A ship that was originally built for the Navy, an icebreaker that later served with the Coast Guard, named the Glacier. The service of the Glacier, and that time in 1975 when the Glacier almost shared the fate of Shackleton's Endurance, is history that deserves to be remembered. The USS Glacier was launched in 1954. The ship, built for icebreaking, had a heavily reinforced hull and mounted massive diesel-electric engines. In fact, the largest capacity single-armature DC motors ever installed on a ship, driving the ship's two shafts with a massive 21,000 shaft horsepower. 309 feet long and displacing 8,448 long tons, she had a relatively short length in proportion to her engine power, and her bow had the characteristic sloping forefoot that enabled her to ride up on heavy ice and break it with the weight of the vessel. The ship also had 4 aft and side heeling tanks that enabled the ship to break free from ice by rapidly shifting seawater, heeling from side to side and changing trim fore to aft. Glacier was the flagship of Rear Admiral Richard Byrd on the first Operation Deep Freeze, the code name for a series of U.S. missions to Antarctica that began in 1955 and established a permanent U.S. presence on the continent. One of Glacier's first missions was to help establish and supply the U.S. Naval Air Facility at McMurdo Sound, now called McMurdo Station, the largest community on the continent of Antarctica. The Glacier performed several missions in both the Arctic and the Antarctic for the Navy, notably in 1960 participating in the rescue of the Argentine icebreaker ARA General San Martin when it became trapped in ice. In 1965, she was famously photographed alongside the USS Atka and the USS Burton Island, pushing a huge iceberg out of the shipping lane used to supply McMurdo Station. The Glacier was transferred to the Coast Guard in 1966, where it continued in Arctic and Antarctic service. Famously, in 1967, the Glacier traveled across the Arctic Circle, the International Dateline, the Equator, and the Antarctic Circle, all in a period of just 6 weeks. Between 1968 and 1975, the Glacier was involved in scientific expeditions to explore the Weddell Sea, the same place where Shackleton's expedition had been marooned. Such operations could be extremely risky. As the Glacier moved to its research point in the Weddell Sea during the 1974-75 season, it was encased in fog. The captain, Clarence Gillette, went up with a scientific team on one of the ship's helicopters to assess the situation. But the fog was thicker and extended higher than expected, and the helicopter became lost until it was low on fuel. The Glacier had an LTV landing craft that could quickly rescue the helicopter if it had to set down at sea, but the davits that would be used to lower the LTV were frozen solid, and the craft wouldn't lower. The backup plan required a crewman to go into the water with a lifeline, a procedure that could risk the crewman's life. But before the rescue was required, the helicopter managed to land, propelled by the momentum of its last few drops of fuel. During the same season, the Glacier was in an ice field in heavy fog. Watchmen were watching for icebergs that may harm the ship, hoping to identify them in time to maneuver out of their way. But in the heavy fog, the process was described as feeling the iceberg before you could actually see it. The ship struck a large iceberg, which dug a 9-foot hole in the bow. The ship was only saved by its sturdy, double-hull design. On March 6th, Glacier was returning to its home port in Long Beach, having finished doing its scientific soundings in the Weddell Sea, when it received a distress call. It was the Argentine icebreaker General San Martin, the same one that the Glacier had assisted in 1960. Launched in 1954, the 229-foot, 5,300-ton General San Martin had been in the Weddell Sea providing supplies to Argentine Antarctic bases when it experienced engine trouble. A fierce autumn storm rocked the area, sending 40-foot thick sheets of ice tumbling into the water. The ice floe was quickly turning to pack ice, and the Glacier was needed to help free the vessel. There was added pressure as well. Argentina and Chile were in an ongoing border dispute regarding Antarctic territories and islands in the Beagle Channel on the southern tip of South America. That conflict would eventually bring the two countries to the brink of war, and tensions were high. The General San Martin had become stranded within sight of a Chilean base in the Chilean Antarctic territory, and Chile was now accusing Argentina of spying. The U.S. wanted the Glacier to free the General San Martin before the issue escalated further. It was a dangerous time to enter the Weddell Sea, but the Glacier, with 229 aboard, including 13 civilian scientists and 3 teenage cadets from the Navy Sea Cadet Program, was some 3,000 tons heavier than the General San Martin, making it more capable of breaking up the growing pack ice. Pack ice can be as hard as concrete and can form quickly. Ice between the islands at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula was creating what is called a pressure zone. Usually, when ice is broken, it floats freely out to sea, but with a pressure zone, the broken ice crowds around the ship. The Glacier was only able to break a few yards at a time, and then had to reverse in order to get a running start and break more ice, sort of like trying to free your car when it's stuck in the snow. But as it reversed, its propellers were hitting the ice that was crowding behind the ship. As the Glacier reversed, one of its massive screws, huge propellers that gave the ship the power to push the bow up in the ice to break it, ground into the pack ice, which was described as steel hard, and one of the massive 6-ton blades of the propeller sheared off. While the Glacier's hull was designed to be able to ram and break ice from both the bow or stern, the propellers were not used to chop or break ice. Their job was to push the ship up on the ice, where the ship's weight and a process of rapidly shifting of seawater inside the hull would cut through the ice. The blades were not meant to contact the ice. The effect of the massive blade being torn off was so dramatic that crew members aboard described the sound as a loud explosion that shook the ship. Losing one of its screws meant a significant loss in power, and if the other screw became damaged, the ship would not be able to move. Moreover, the pack ice, moving in by a strong storm, was described as more than 25 feet thick. The Glacier, despite being one of America's largest icebreakers at the time, was designed only to cut through ice 20 feet thick. The Glacier was trapped within sight of the General San Martin. As the Antarctic was moving into winter, being stuck could literally mean spending months in the ice. This presented two problems. The first was supply. The Glacier was well supplied with food and, more critically, the fuel needed to power and heat critical sections of the ship, but not enough to maintain the entire crew for the several months that they might be stranded. Clearly, some of the crew would need to be evacuated, even as the skeleton crew would need to spend the winter on the ship. Fuel was the larger worry, and the ship reduced activity to reduce fuel consumption from 1,700 gallons to 1,200 gallons a day. The other issue was the pressure of the ice on the hull, the same pressure that eventually sank Shackleton's Endurance. The Glacier's hull was built so that ice pressure would push it upwards rather than crushing the hull, but that action could actually cause the ship to capsize. The Glacier contacted a second U.S. icebreaker, the Coast Guard cutter Burton Island. The Burton Island might be able to provide assistance, especially adding the help of its 2 HH-3H Pelican helicopters. However, at just 6,500-ton displacement, the Burton Island would not be able to help break the Glacier free, as a Coast Guard spokesman said at the time. She's much smaller than the Glacier, so you figure if the Glacier gets stuck, for sure the Burton Island will. The Burton Island moved as close as it could in the open sea, about 12 miles from the Glacier. The initial plans included ferrying all but a few volunteers to the nearby Chilean base using the helicopters from the Glacier and the Burton Island. They could then be flown by plane to Argentina. Some were moved to the Burton Island, which also would have some crew evacuated in case it had to winter in the area to provide support. Robert Wilcox, a science attaché with the State Department, explained, "We felt it best to pull off everyone except a skeleton crew, and that way we'd be able to conserve food and fuel in case the crew had to stay for a while." At the same time, the crew began developing plans both to try to free the ship and to be prepared in case they had to spend the winter. While they created a plan to create ice docks on either side of the ship to prevent it capsizing, there was hope in that the crew could see a crack in the ice about a mile away. If they could maneuver to the crack, they might be able to escape. Given the weather in the Antarctic, the evacuation certainly could be dangerous, as the previous event with the helicopter and the captain earlier in the season well demonstrated. The evacuation began March 8th, as a symbol of the dedication of the Coasties, whose motto is Semper Paratus, always prepared. So many volunteered to stay that some had to be ordered to evacuate. The initial evacuation went perfectly, as Dr. Walter Seelig of the Glacier Scientific Party was quoted in the newspaper The Ottawa Citizen. "Dawn came up clear and beautiful, and we were all taken off without a problem." He described the helicopter evacuation as smooth as silk. But to underlie the risk, the next day weather prevented Argentinian C-130 aircraft from landing to take those evacuated to South America. While the crew at the Chilean base were described as perfect hosts, the evacuees were eating, in their words, frozen penguin. As to the glacier's escape, there was a problem. The ship was facing the wrong direction. Turning around with only one propeller while stuck in pack ice more than 20 feet thick is no easy task. The solution required dynamite and something called a dead man. The crew rigged a long spar, called a dead man, to the ship's anchor. The crew would then blow a hole in the ice using dynamite, move the anchor over the hole with the spar, drop the anchor in the hole, and use the anchor chain to pull the ship. After doing this several times, the crew was able to turn itself towards the crack in the ice. At the time, a Coast Guard spokesman described the situation. There's about 1.5 miles of really tough going, and probably 5 or 6 miles altogether of ice between the glacier and clear water. In the end, the glacier was able to break free, with Captain Clarence Gillette radioing that the ship had made it to open water on March 11th. A crewman suggested that the broken propeller may actually have helped them, as it caused a constant wobble that helped move the ice. Later, there was a shift in the weather, and winds broke up the ice enough that the Burton Island was able to help the General San Martin escape as well. The glacier recovered the crew that had been evacuated, freeing those still at the Chilean base from the fate of eating more frozen penguin. The ship picked up the remainder of the evacuees at the town of Ushuaia, the capital of the Argentine province of Tierra del Fuego, and the southernmost city in the world, March 14th, and limped back to Long Beach. It's difficult to say how much risk the ship really faced. The Coast Guard tried to minimize the concern, saying that they had plenty of food and fuel for the crew that were left on board. Dr. Seelig perhaps put the best spin on it. He said if they were stuck in the ice all winter, then they could study the movement of the ice flow. Keith Corson, who was 14 years old and a member of the Naval Cadet Corps, saw it as a grand adventure. He said, "The ice is magnificent. I wish I could stay down here." But trying to survive an Antarctic winter on a 300-foot boat is nothing to scoff at. And the travails of Glacier's 1974-75 season well demonstrate the dangers that are faced by those who choose to serve on the world's least hospitable continent. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Glacier, which served 11 years with the Navy and 21 years with the Coast Guard, and had 29 Antarctic deployments and 10 Arctic deployments, was decommissioned in 1987. Spent several years with the National Defense Reserve Fleet, but despite efforts to save the vessel, she was scrapped in 2012. The members of the Coast Guard and the other services, as well as the scientists who choose to live on the world's most inhospitable continent in the name of science, are a rare breed. Given that the personal risks that they take are done for the benefit of humanity, you might actually call them heroes. Certainly, they deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.